an original MCM production.
That you guys have made an effort to come down to see. So, without further ado, this is about confronting mass incarceration. This is something that we at Turners have decided that we want to take on. And there's a sign-up sheet over there for anybody else who'd like to join us in one way or another, just even being on the email list for our events and when issues come up, because we would really love to have your presence and your accompaniment. And we're under the mission of trying to cut in half the Wisconsin prison population in 10 years. Cut in half the population in 10 years. It's a lot of work, but there's so many groups out there working on this, and everybody's doing their own thing. They're doing it in their own way, that if we all get together, I think we can have an impact, and that's what we need. I think we can have an impact. So, our moderator is Dr. Robert Smith, is the Harry G. John Professor of History and is Director of the Center for Urban Research, Teaching and Outreach at Marquette University. Dr. Smith is the author of Race, Labor, and Civil Rights, Griggs versus Duke Power, and the Expansion of Equal Employment Opportunity. Rob's research and teaching interests consider the intersections of race and law, and his current project explores the relationships between civil and human rights attorneys in the United States and South Africa during the latter stages of apartheid. He hails from Indianapolis, but we're glad that he's here. And that he used to be with UWM, but Marquette stole it.
That's a little, my mic will stay on. I'll hold the button here. Thank you all this evening for coming out and having this conversation with us. We've got some dynamite folks on the panel. What I'll do is offer some quick introductions because we want to make sure to give quite a bit of time to hear from folks, particularly our authors who are going to give a little bit of information on some of their research and how it connects to today's themes. Let me first begin by moving from right to left, your left to right, and introduce our panelists. Attorney Jerome Buting is the defense counsel, was the defense counsel in State v. Avery, subject of the famed Netflix documentary, and author of Illusion of Justice, Inside Making a Murderer in America's Broken System. Next we have Attorney Walt Linear, is a lecturer on race and constitutional law, is the director of multicultural affairs and community engagement at MATC and leader of its Men of Color initiative, and also the senior pastor of Progressive Baptist Church. We also have Dr. R.L. McNeely, chairperson of Felmers Chaney Advocacy Board and author of Race, Crime, and Criminal Justice, a retired attorney and UWM professor of social welfare. And we want to certainly thank the woman next to me here who I like to, if you don't mind, I'd like to just say a couple of words about her. I won't go through all of the long lists of awards this awesome book is winning. I couldn't remember them all, and if I listed them all and read them all, it'd take us a while. But Heather Ann Thompson hails from Detroit, Michigan, and is the child of long-term labor radicals who fought extensively for basic principles of justice throughout the city of Detroit and nationally. She is the author of Who's Detroit, one of her major works, her earlier work that looked at and questioned one fundamental question, which was, what is going to happen or what happened to Detroit, Michigan in the post World War II era, particularly the post-1960s era and after the Detroit riot. And that particular work questions a whole range of issues around race, class, employment, labor, and politics. But I also want to say that Dr. Thompson is also a skilled university administrator. I've watched her navigate, demand, storm, and make sure that institutions live up to the creeds that they oftentimes will fall short of if you don't have folks with her voice and her commitment. And then I also have to say that she's been an awesome mentor to me. Early on, as we worked both at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and had a really great time working together, and I was very much impacted by all of the mentoring and direction that she offered me early on. But then we get this book titled Blood in the Water, right? That is its own tour de force. It's making its own imprint on a whole range of matters connected to history and race and criminalization and prisons and a whole range of topics. And I remember a moment when she first started working on this project, and the first conversation that we had was, we couldn't believe there wasn't an extensive work on the Attica Rebellion. We couldn't believe that there hadn't been scores of works unveiling what we knew was a pit of deceit and egregious abuses of power as it relates to the experiences of those men who were part of that upsurge and part of that moment. And so what we're going to do today, first, join me in thanking Dr. Thompson and the rest of our panelists as well, please. So what we'll do today is we're going to start. We're going to ask Dr. Thompson to lead us off and offer some of her comments as it relates to this brilliant work and the themes of today. And then we'll turn it over to Attorney Buting and ask him to do some of the similar kinds of, provide some of the similar kinds of commentary on what he's experienced in his work. And then we'll move to Dr. McNeely for a similar kind of set of examples based on the work that he's been a part of. And then, Pastor, it's only appropriate that we let you wrap things up for us to give us some contextualization of all of what we hear from these folks today. And then we'll very quickly after that move into some Q&A so that we can get the audience involved. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Heather Ann Thompson. Heather, please take us away.
Thank you so much, Rob, and thank all of you for coming out on a Sunday and for welcoming me to Milwaukee, which is only a 45-minute flight. I was kind of startled. It's very close from Detroit, which I should have remembered because I was here about 4 years ago and had an amazing time getting to talk to university students about an issue that I'm still going to be talking about, although I feel like a lot's changed since I was here 4 years ago. I'm actually not going to talk right now about the book on Attica, and I hope to see you perhaps tomorrow night. I'm going to actually come here tomorrow night and do an entire talk on Attica with some amazing slides that will kind of animate both the story of Attica, but also the journey to write the book, which was 13 years and is related to the theme that brings us all here today, which is the importance of transparency and getting information out if we are truly to have a democracy. But the other hat that I wear and have worn the entire time I was doing that book was also as someone who was an activist and an advocate to end incarceration. And I did a lot of policy work in DC and had the opportunity to be on a blue ribbon panel that met for 2 years to really just comb every possible piece of information there was on both the causes and consequences of mass incarceration with an end goal of trying to help inform the discussion. How might we end this? And so I just will make a few remarks on that and then leave it to my colleagues up here to share their wisdom on this. In short, I won't begin with the mess that we are in, because I think anyone sitting here is here today because we know that we're in a mess. We are in a mess with our democracy. We're in a mess, in particular, with incarceration. And unfortunately for your state, mine is not much better. We in Michigan locks up more children for life than any other state but Pennsylvania. Your state has the dubious claim to fame of having the worst racial disparity of any state in the nation. So I don't need to tell you the problem. But I do think that this question of strategies is looming ever more important. And I just want to leave my mark here with just two comments on strategy. One, the importance of messaging in strategy, and the other, just the importance of some practical strategies that I know that Mr. McNeely will also pick up on. With regard to strategy, the message, I think it is critically important if we're going to end this crisis of incarceration that we begin by exploding some myths that persist amazingly. I do talks 3 cities a week, and it's amazing to me how these myths persist. And one of them has to do with how we got here, and the other one has to do with the efficacy of where we are. The first, how we got here. Many people don't like mass incarceration, but they believe that we ended up on this path because we had to be here. And you need to know that we started this war on crime. We actually started the war on crime long before we had a crime problem in this country. The murder rate had actually not been that low since the 19-teens. And I won't bore you with the details of this, but needless to say, we started this massive war on crime for political reasons. And because we did that, because this was political in origin and bipartisanly political in origin, actually began with Johnson, not Nixon, the only way out of this is going to be bipartisan and it's going to be political, meaning that we're going to have to face that this is not about crime, that this is about politics. The second myth has to do with whether or not where we are has any benefits, because you will hear people all over the country say, well, even if I don't like incarceration, you know, you got to face it. The violent crime rate hasn't been this low in a long, long time. And there's a lot of people that very secretly, they might not say it loudly, say, well, does it work? As offensive as it is, does it work? And another myth, it does not. Mass incarceration actually makes us less safe, not more. The violent crime rate goes up and down independent of the incarceration rate. They are largely disaggregated. This has been laid to rest. But the violence rate in communities most impacted by incarceration has gone up. So to the extent there's a relationship, it is a devastating one for the communities already most marginalized from incarceration. The other thing that I think we have to think about in terms of myth busting is this idea of do the crime, do the time. We have got to just get rid of any notion in this country that those who are locked up are there because they are the ones that do the crime, and therefore those who are not are not. You know, I don't need to bore you with the details, but as the mother of a teenage girl right now who's living in a suburb for the first time in my life, I can assure you that there's a whole lot of crime being committed and there ain't no time being done. I'm not throwing my daughter under the bus, I'll just throw all of her friends under the bus. But I'm just telling you, when it comes to drug use and shoplifting and joyriding and buying alcohol, and I mean, we could just go on and on and on. And the fact of the matter is that is a complete mythology that we have mass incarceration because there's this connection between doing the crime and doing the time. That's not simply where the police are. The final thing on this, in terms of myth busting, is, or maybe it's not even so much myth busting, I think we need to, as much as I just said everything's political, I think we are never going to end this if we only come at this as a political question. We have to come at it as a moral question, and we have to be willing to say just that. The system is immoral, it is unjust, and frankly, if it were moral, then the first thing that we would do when one of our own family members was drug addicted or mentally ill, or even, God help us, committed a horrific crime, we'd be all for it. Send our kids there, call the police. But the truth is that people with means think of all kinds of other ways of dealing with social distress in the criminal justice system. And so it is a moral issue. And when you have, in my state, almost 400 children serving life sentences, Pennsylvania, almost 400 children serving life sentences, more people serving life than at any other time in American history, more people doing time period for the same crime than ever before in American history. That is a moral question. In addition to being a political cause and effect, it's a moral question for us to enter it. My last comment is simply that that's the message making of strategies, but there's also a very practical thing that has to be brought to bear on the ending of mass incarceration. And it has to do, firstly, the theme is the theme of this discussion, transparency. But the first one I would say has to be in the realm of policing and prosecution. That we have to make much better use of our knowledge base of what's really going on in our cities, where the policing is and where it is not, and where our prosecutors are using discretion and where they are not. It is not true that prosecutors can't use discretion. They use discretion every single day in my largely white suburban community. That's why all my daughter's friends are not locked up right now. It's not true. Take this off the tape. But I'm using that by saying that we have a responsibility with our elected officials to know that they're using prosecutions fairly, that there's not selective prosecution in our communities, and the same thing with policing. That policing is not selective, that it is actually being employed to make us safer universally. And the final one is our prisons, and that is what I mostly write about. I mostly write about the importance of transparency in prisons. Right now, and you might find it shocking, our prisons are in worse shape than they were in 1971 when the Attica uprising started. There's more people doing solitary confinement for longer and longer periods of time. There is more overcrowding. There is more violence. There is more trauma behind these walls. Oh, by the way, that was another myth before I forgot. It was on my list of myths. We have to explode this myth that there's a difference between victims and offenders. And that to be anti-incarceration means that you're being somehow anti-victim. There are ways to be safe and just. You should support victims, absolutely. And that doesn't mean you have to support mass incarceration. And we need to bear witness to the fact that virtually everyone in prison is actually also a victim. So this victim-offender dichotomy, we have to be very, very careful. In fact, my son worked in a juvenile facility. 100% of the children in that juvenile facility had previously been a victim of assault and violence. So 100%. So again, safety versus that. So transparency. We pay for these prisons. Our taxes pay for them. These are public institutions. They are failing institutions, and I can think of no other institution in this country, not a single one, that the citizenry throws this kind of money at, gives this kind of faith, but you can't go in them, you can't look at them, you don't have any information about what goes on behind those walls, and they have a 70% failure rate. That is to say, simple recidivism. If that's your measure, not even to mention all the other trauma, but if your measure is their success rate, their dismal failure. So we have to demand transparency. We have to be able to go in prisons. Our legislators have to be able to go in prison anytime they want. I don't care if it's 3 o'clock in the morning or 2 a.m., it doesn't matter, right? And if our families are in them, we have to have access to how our loved ones are being treated inside. And if we are victims of a crime, we have to make sure that what's being done in our name is not creating further trauma. Thank you.
Attorney Buting, would you like to offer some of your thoughts on the matter?
Sure. First, did I hear you're from Indianapolis?
I am.
So am I. How about that? We have 2 Hoosiers on this panel.
Okay.
So yeah, my role is a criminal defense attorney. It's different than, it's more at the front end, I guess, of the mass incarceration problem. You know, I work as an advocate, case by case, one-on-one with individuals. And, you know, there are some other criminal defense attorneys here in the audience, and so they know what I mean. I also, though, work in broader sense on, I've been on the criminal justice reform commissions and state bar commissions and as well as criminal defense organizations where we've tried to deal with bigger policy questions about how, you know, how do we make the system more fair for the individual, and then, you know, at the back end, hopefully also reduce incarceration by not having people wrongly convicted and having those who are rightly convicted get a reasonable, fair punishment rather than some, lock them up and throw away the key response that you see too often. I also, as a criminal defense attorney though, it's because I work one-on-one with people, I see the faces of these individuals. These aren't just numbers. When we hear about the thousands of people that are locked up for years and years and years and years, they are all individuals. They all have families, most of them anyway. And, even the ones who are convicted because they did do something wrong, it doesn't mean that we should just throw them out in the garbage as if they're not human. They made mistakes. They made mistakes of judgment. Oftentimes, though, the crime that they are sitting in prison for is more of a snapshot of what happened on one particular day or a short period of their lives, often fueled by alcohol, drugs, and it does not portray who that person is in all of their aspects. Now, when it comes to, and one of the interesting, a little aside here, the intersections between my book and Heather's, my book is very different than Heather's. Hers is great. Mine is more of like a memoir of my career as a criminal defense attorney, and in particular, what I've seen wrong, the flaws in the justice system, as some of which are portrayed in the Netflix documentary Making a Murderer, and I use other cases of my career. Well, one of them that I spend a good deal of time on in the book is the case from Madison, a gentleman by the name of Ralph Armstrong. And he actually was initially imprisoned for a sexual assault that he committed when he was 18 years old in New Mexico, way back in the 70s. And so he was actually down in New Mexico when their riots took place, the prison riots. And so despite growing up, he spent a number of years, I think 7 or 8 years there, he and others managed to get through there. And one of the things that's nice about Heather's book is she puts faces on these people as well. We get to know some of the individuals who actually were injured and have lived for many, many years with what happened in Attica during that uprising and its aftermath. So, but back to the question, the broader question of transparency. And one of the things that we hope to be able to do with discussions like this is try and empower you as individual citizens to go out and do something to try and contribute to a reduction of mass incarceration. And particularly when it comes to transparency and understanding what's going on in our system, there are some things that can be done. Let me tell you one thing that a lot of people don't know about a criminal case is that when it comes to discovery of the other side, that is the government's case, it's ridiculously restrictive. You can't do depositions of people. You can't get access to all kinds of records that, if this was a civil case and I was a lawyer against Google or Ford or somebody like that, I would be able to do depositions, and where only money is at stake in civil cases, only money is at stake, there's wide open discovery. In criminal cases where someone's liberty, or in some states even their life, is at stake, it's very constrained and restricted what you can do at the front end to try and discover what happened in the case and whether or not this is the right individual who's been charged, or whether he or she is facing the potential of a wrongful conviction. So one of the things that I think we can do here in Wisconsin is to try and encourage our legislators to open up the discovery in criminal cases. We should not be afraid of information. In this day and age where we have enormous exchange of information on the internet, we should not be afraid and restricting it when it comes to sharing it with a defense attorney. The other thing that we can do here, we do have a very good tradition in this state under our open records laws, our Freedom of Information Act type laws. And you know, I was frankly very proud of the response about a year, let's see, it was maybe a year and a half ago. The Walker administration tried to sneak a fast one by people. The Public Records Board, with less than 24 hours notice, decided that we're going to change the rule and the definition of what type of documents must be even retained at all. They decided we're going to start classifying a whole lot of otherwise public records that had to be retained for a long time. We're going to call those transient records that can be destroyed without notice. And you know, the outcry, thankfully, when it became public that was going on, the outcry was enormous all over the state, so much so they had to back down and rescind that attempted change in the rule. So, you know, that is a way that I don't know what New York's Open Records or Freedom of Information Act laws are like in comparison to Wisconsin, but you know, Heather a good deal of her book talks about the difficulties that she had even gaining access to these documents, and it's really true that if you as citizens can't gain access to the kind of records that relate to the problem of mass incarceration, then we're never going to be able to get a grip on this. So I think that's a good place to start, and that's why we had this panel today on that topic. I have some other examples of things I can talk about later, but for an introduction, that's good. Okay?
Thank you. Professor McNeely, please jump in.
Okay. You know, I've been listening, and of course, one of the major themes is this issue of transparency. And let's not divorce that from the treatment of the individuals who are in these non-transparent institutions. So the question becomes, what is it that we can do about it? Anybody have a thought? We can say that we need transparency, but what's the mechanism? It's obviously not the Freedom of Information Act, because as you may or may not know, in Wisconsin, in order to get any information from the Department of Corrections, one must know the title of the document in which the information appears. And if you don't know the title of the document, you know, bye-bye. See you later. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. So that's a perfect way for DLC to never have to provide the information. In other words, if you don't have a title on the document, then how is it that one seeking a document is ever going to be able to get the information? I do have a solution, or at least maybe something that's ameliorative in nature, and that's something that's called an oversight board. And let me preface that by saying independent oversight board. By that I mean not one that is under the control of the Department of Corrections. It's independent of the Department of Corrections. Now, an oversight board is also a monitoring board. So what we're talking about is an oversight and monitoring board whereby what's going on in an institution is public, in the sense that there is a board. This is another key, that is statutorily authorized. In other words, authorized by statute in the via the state legislature to be there to monitor the activities, to have access to the information, to be able to walk through the halls anytime unannounced. Now, this may seem to be a bit of a fantasy to some of you, except it's not that uncommon in Europe. There are even some places here in this country where there are these sorts of boards. And indeed, we had one right here in Milwaukee, although it was not statutorily authorized, which meant that the Department of Correction could terminate it at will, which it did. That board was the Felmers Chaney Advisory Board. Now, some of you know that there is a prison right on Fond du Lac, just a bit south of Locust, and that's the Felmers Old Chaney Pre-Release Correctional Center. Well, the Department of Corrections doesn't like to call it the pre-release center. They just want it to be the correctional center. But it's a pre-release center. And the board was an independent board that perhaps to the surprise of DLC, more or less evolved over time. The cries from the Department of Corrections to the respective superintendents was, get that board under control. But they couldn't get that board under control, which is another key, and that is these monitoring boards need to be made up, at least in terms of a large preponderance of the individuals serving on the board, of people who cannot be bamboozled by the Department of Corrections. You need people who know something about the law, i.e. as in attorneys. You need people who know something about administering large bureaucracies, and et cetera. And you need people that have some practical prior experiences that would lead them to be astute observers of what's going on. Now, at the Chaney Center, we actually had a tool, which was a questionnaire that the superintendent had to report on every time there was a meeting of the board, and the board met every 2 months. And that tool had a lot of things on it, like the number of disciplinary actions, you know, and that was for both staff and inmates. Maybe I should cut this really short, because I can take up every. Basically, here's the deal. We wanted to get institutional data on recidivism rates, because that gives you some idea of the successfulness of these correctional facilities. We fought a tooth and nail battle, following which we were divorced from the Department of Corrections, and we have arisen as an independent community board, not affiliated with the Department of Corrections at all. Thank you. So to make my message short, let me put it this way. In terms of seeking solutions, or at least seeking some progress with regard to the kinds of problems that have been discussed, what needs to be done is for FCAP to continue moving forward, but what about the thought of maybe some alliance with the Turners and with other organizations, so that we can press our state legislators and others, use our contacts effectively to do what is being done in other places, like in Europe, all the time. There's a good literature on this that already exists. A key person is Michelle Dietz. By the way, there's an article that was written by Stan Stojkovic, who is the dean of the School of Social Welfare at UWM, and Michael Cockcroft, who was the former superintendent of the Chaney Center, and me. And that article details how you can take an institution that's become a warehouse. You guys have heard that term before, a warehouse, and transform it into an institution that is exemplary, because that's what we in fact did during the 12, 13 years of the existence of the board. That article has been published in the Journal of Community Corrections, and I can send it to anyone who has an interest. It's a blueprint for how you go about succeeding in making an institution something that you're pleased with, where the inmates, when you come in, look at you and smile, rather than having other sorts of affect with unknown people. All right, well, in any event, that may have been a strange way to end it, but those are some comments.
Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have Attorney Walt Linear offer some of his thoughts and reflections on these matters, and then we'll move right away to a Q&A. So please begin to get your questions prepared for the panelists, and then we'll reserve a few minutes at the end to allow either of the panelists to offer a few parting shots before we wrap up. Attorney Lanier.
Yes, sir. Good evening, everybody. Well, you all would get an F in Baptist church protocol. You got to talk back to me a little bit. Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Thank you very much. First of all, I'm glad to be here. I do want to honor the author, Heather Ann Thompson. Phenomenal book, kept me engaged from start to finish. You're an awesome storyteller. It just drew me in completely. Drew my emotions up and down, mostly down. You know, sometimes up, but mostly down. Where to enter into this conversation? I want to be brief and talk about a few observations that I just had, particularly reading the book. I saw three basic failures in terms of just basic failures, and also talking about narrative and messaging. There was a basic failure of government accountability. They just did not do their jobs. Nothing profound, nothing deep, nothing Einsteinian, nothing requiring 4 or 5 degrees or a PhD or a JD. Just do your job. Just do your job. I was particularly compelled by the first list of demands that they made, not the one where they talked about getting a plane to another country, but the initial. Yeah, but hey, you know, negotiate. But the first list of demands they made, I wrote a note to myself throughout the reading. The list of demands of Attica prisoners reflected a tragic truth of giving government bureaucracies to do their jobs with excellence. Because that's all their initial demands were. If you looked at it, it was like, oh, you just mean you want us to just do our jobs? Treat you the way we're supposed to treat you, feed the way we're supposed to feed you, medicate, give you medical service, and so an absolute failure of basic doing your job. Nothing deep, nothing profound. Do your job. Do your job. Baseline government accountability. A second was a failure of humanity or morality. You know, failure to look at somebody as human, as somebody who has a face or a name, as somebody who's somebody's father, somebody's son, somebody's child, somebody's brother. And so there's an absolute failure of humanity on the part of that system. And that was tragic. And then third was a basic failure of citizenry. So these are, whatever happens, incarcerated, yes, in Attica, yes, but nonetheless still citizens, and should be afforded some basic rights, and those were not afforded. And so I saw those both not only as truths, but also when you talk about message and message turning in this time and season of so much information, how can we make it plain? There was that. There's failure of accountability, a failure of humanity, and a failure of citizenry on part of Attica. The second, this is kind of as I was walking through the book, and this was I won't call it a high point, but a light in a dark place. Here are some of the least of these, if you will. You're incarcerated in Attica. So you have, you know, no power, zero, none, you know, far less than us assembled here on this Sunday evening, well-dressed, well-fed, well-lighted, well-moisturized, well-mic'd, right? You know what I mean? We're here. But nonetheless, they made some things happen. They made some moves. They made some demands and forced the system to deal with them. They mobilized and they organized and they structured and they strategized and they read and they made demands of the system. They made the system respond. You knew, I mean, one, because you knew the history, and plus you know the system. It's not likely they would succeed, but they, almost want to say they got close. I'll get into that in my third point. But my point is, these with absolutely, in theory, no power, were able to mobilize, organize, strategize, and take some ground, notwithstanding its tragic end. And so that was my second observation. The third observation was that same one, that order established speaks to the capacity of those incarcerated to be productive. And I don't say that as a matter of shock, that didn't surprise me, but as a reflection of the loss to our community where they were not returned. Here was another group of people that when pressed and stressed and the situation arose, they were able to organize and mobilize, be productive, advocate, protect the hostages, and engage in the work of democracy. And how tragic a loss to the community to not say, hey, how can we at least take a shot at rehabilitation and get some of these minds back into the community. And I think this may be my last point, maybe. This inability to do peacemaking. It was too fast from the beginning. If they wanted this to be resolved with less bloodshed, they needed time. There was no understanding of this from the beginning. There was, and this is no shock to us here, there's no vision on the other side, if you will, that perhaps something can come out of this. Perhaps there is a path that can come out of this without bloodshed. There did not seem to be much seriousness in the hierarchy. I'll say vision for a way, a path to do this differently. And I happen to be kind of wired for peacemaking. I'm a conflict resolver, always look to make peace, always look to de-escalate. And it seemed to me just in the reading and the listening that there was probably a path. It was going to take some time, some back and forth, some engaging, some narrowing down of issues, but there would seem to be a complete lack of willingness to consider substantively any alternative other than, hey, at some point, okay, time's up, we're going in there with guns a-blazing, going in there with chemicals, etc. That's the end game. And then there could have been much less loss of life. And so those are the observations I made on the book. And in terms of doing things, I taught at UWM for a couple years, race and justice and change and blacks in the Constitution, and I was always encouraged and frustrated at the end of the semester because the students were so richly engaged and so seriously looking for solutions and actions. And if we can find better ways to equip our students and our youth and get them engaged sooner in some of this work before we, move on, then I think that's a singular thought. How do we engage more particularly on the college campus? And I'll give a shout out for MATC, the community college campus, because there are people there hungry for solutions, critical thinking, engagements like this to do some work on the ground. So I will let it go there. I have some other thoughts, but I'm glad to be here.
All right, we'll open up for some questions, and of course we'll ask that indeed offer some questions. I'm sure that on some of these issues we have a whole range of feelings and emotions and comments that we'd like to make, but certainly do. Oh, we got one more comment. Get your questions ready and make sure they're framed as questions, and if they're targeted at a particular panelist, please let us know. But Professor McNeely, you have one more comment you'd like to share first?
Earlier, there was a reference to the impact of mass incarceration on communities. And we didn't spend much time with that thought, but I thought maybe we should spend a little more time with that thought before we go further. And not to trivialize this, but here's a little analogy. And This, by the way, is a true story. I can't recall what country, but this was in Africa. And it was on a game preserve, large game preserve, on which there were elephants and other animals. And there was a difficulty on this preserve because some of the young bull elephants were killing the rhinoceros. You know about that. And there was a lot of effort and thought that went into, well, how can we stop this? And everything that got tried was not successful until somebody said, well, maybe we need more older bull elephants put on the preserve. And guess what happened? When they put the older bull elephants on the preserve, the killing of the rhinoceros by the young bull elephant stopped because the older bull elephant said, you're not going to, The point I'm making to you is, when you have this mass incarceration, what's happening to the bull elephants of those neighborhoods? Where are they? When you think about it, every single indicator of well-being is when I say well-being, I'm talking about a neighborhood, like, for example, percentage of dropouts, percentage of those who are impregnated at a very early age, percentage of those who are abusing drugs or alcohol, percentage of those who are engaged in some sort of criminal behavior. I'm talking about serious criminal behavior. Every single one of those things has something to do with, now this is not to say that everybody in single parent families is not doing a wonderful job, because there are, but if you take 10,000 families that are single parent homes, that are single parent families versus those who are two parent families, guess which one consistently scores higher on the ladder? Mass incarceration leads to the decimation of neighborhoods and communities because we don't have those bull elephants that we need to keep the young bull elephants in check. And that's a thought that I have as a role of those who have been incarcerated, who come back to our communities, that they could serve as, because they've got credibility, they could serve as those older bull elephants if we could create structures that would allow, and institutions that would allow that kind of influence to be rendered in the neighborhoods. But maybe it'd be better not to have them going into the prisons in the first place.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
Hi, thanks for this event tonight. The issue about transparency made me think of an experience I had exactly a week ago. Exactly a week ago, I was down at Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola, Louisiana, the site of the Angola Prison Rodeo. I went down there specifically because I knew it was going to be the only opportunity I'd have to get into a maximum security prison, the largest one in the country apparently, and talk with actual prisoners. They have a rodeo, but at the same time, they have the events, the horse riding, you know, this crazy stuff. But at the same time, they also have a prison hobby craft fair where prisoners can sell their wares that they are allowed to make in their, I don't know, ridiculous craft environments. It's absurd. But I was able to, so they're actual prisoners. I didn't know this at the time when I went down there, that are selling their wares. And I was able to make these connections with several, more than just a couple of inmates in conversation, and actually learn what it is like in the prison and how they felt about it. That was an aspect of transparency I had never had before. I just want to end by saying that, you know, there were probably 12,000 civilians there who probably weren't there with the same intent to learn as I had. They were there to buy their, you know, cheap wooden furniture, whatever, jewelry. And I'm just wondering, I mean, I'm not wondering. All I could conclude was that these people are complicit in the exploitation of these prisoners and perpetuation of this system. Thank you.
Anybody like to respond? We'll take a few. Okay, grab a couple more questions and then we'll respond.
First of all, for you Hoosiers, we'd like to thank you for Junior Bridgman and Ken Benson. Okay. I like to add to RL. My name is Milton Bond. I'm an instructor at MATC. I was a teacher at MPS. What RL was talking about was in Africa, there was a country that they were poaching the elephants, and they killed all the elephants in this one country. So they didn't have the technology to bring adult elephants. So what they did, they brought in young elephants. And the young elephants, they basically was killing rhinos. And the game wardens was running around thinking, who's killing the rhinos? You know, because elephants aren't elephants by nature. It's a learned behavior. You know, just like our young people, it's a learned behavior. So they thought it was natural to kill rhinos because they didn't have anybody in their jungle showing them what adult elephants do. Right. So what the solution was, and after a few years, they had the technology to bring in some adult bull elephants, and guess what? They stopped killing the rhinos. And the reason I'm saying that and just adding to that is, as an educator, especially an educator of color, as a male, in NPS, we don't have male educators. Now, there's good educators, women, whatever, men, white, black, Asian, but nationally, we only have, I think, less than 2% of all educators are male, all right? So we need, you know, at our institutions, even at the PhD level, maybe Mr. Walter can attest to that, I think we have a shortage of PhDs, you know, that are Afro-American males, and most of them are in education. So we need to show our young people what appropriate behavior is. You know, we need people that look like them, that have the right mindset to show them what appropriate behavior is. We don't just need black males, we need the whole community. But we need to stop putting ceilings on people and hopefully let people rise to be what they can be, just like they let the elephants become what they were meant to be.
Let's do one more and then we'll have our panelists respond. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is James, and I did a lot of time in the Department of Corrections. And what you're talking about, the bull, the Department of Correction uses that anyway. When they get a lot of young guys and they just wild, they'll send somebody over there, not by their choice. They'll just say, pack up, you going over there. And after they see, okay, they see you and they might even know you, so you have some legitimacy. So they start to watch you. You know what I'm saying? So then they start like to model you and see who you talk to and stuff, or what you talk about and stuff like that. So they started to model. So what happened is, once you with them and the administration, you got them calmed down, now police might do something and you say, okay, look, let's write a grievance. Matter of fact, did all y'all see it? Okay, we finna write a mass grievance. So now, after you mobilize them to, you know, if somebody do you wrong, at least say, ouch, you know what I'm saying? At least write a grievance, start the process, so you can go to a lawsuit. What happened was they moved that person and said, no, look, you gotta go. You know what I'm saying? They only wanna use you for their purpose. And they only wanna use you for their purpose, or else you move, you constantly moving. You constantly moving, you know, so that they do that. I was one of them people. Another thing is, when you said, there was no out for the other side. Once you make that thing where you finna protest or anything like that, it's finna be some backlash. So the other side said, oh, you know I'm gonna get you, or know I'm gonna get y'all. So once you take that position, if you meant it or not, you can't say, look, I'm sorry. Ain't no sorry, you know what I'm saying? They're gonna get you. They're gonna do something, mess your mail, put you in a hole, ship you cross country, put you under the jail or something. So once they all got to that yard and this and that. Look, they train for that. You know what I'm saying? They don't train for conflict resolution. What they do, they send in the crisis team. Go talk to them, what they want. I'm saying, and they thing is this. If you just talk to them and let them talk, then whatever the issue is over with. You know what I'm saying? Just let them talk. What happened? And then once the crisis, they said, look, I still want my issue addressed. If it's not addressed, they said, man, move out of here. And then they said, move out of here. Then they come and do whatever they got to do. But when the outside world come in, they say, okay, we talk to a crisis team, they throw them up front. But behind their back, they call them hugger thugs. You know what I'm saying? Anybody, you know what I'm saying? They say, y'all the hugger thugs. You know what I'm saying? When it don't go, when they ain't using them for themselves. But when they is, they say, no, we got an apparatus that we use. We send them in first and see what happened. And I don't know. I had something else to say, but yeah, he said, ain't no male teachers. You know why? Because it's mostly females, nothing against females in the schools. Earlier, you know, when you was growing up, you had recess, you go play on the monkey bars, you do all this. What I'm saying, but now, when a female teacher is, if they see another female, she quiet, she do all her work, she don't do nothing, that's who they pay attention to. But the boys, they want to put on Ritalin, they want to put on drugs, I'm saying, and all this other type of stuff. So we don't even make it up, even get to high school. By the time we going to the penitentiary, we going to the juvenile. That's why it's only 2%. The rest of them in jail. And then another thing about Attica that I found out, when they locked them down for that long period of time, they read. They read Blood in My Eye, George Jackson. They read. That's what happened. And then what reading did for me was humanize me. Then you saying, look, I shouldn't be treated like less of a human being. And talking about, you get tired of every day. They fed us garbage again. The police said something out of order to me. The police pushed me. How many slights can you take? Now you said, look, I'm ready to do whatever it is, because I'm tired. The same thing the civil rights was about. Like James Brown said, I'm a man, I'm the son of a man, and that's what it is. All right, peace and love.
Thank you. Panelists, any responses, comments, thoughts that you'd like to share?
Can I ask a very quick question? Is that okay? I would like somebody to talk about the privatization of prisons. I think that's a big issue. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for that question.
I just wanted to, maybe last question first, the privatization of prisons. I want to just say on that, because this comes up a lot, that in a way, it's a bit of a red herring. That is to say that private prisons are about 7% of all of our prisons. The real job that we have as citizens is to, first of all, they're immoral, they shouldn't exist. It's outrageous that you can profit off of other people's misery, either that crimes have been committed against or that are doing time. But it's about 7%. The state prisons and federal prisons are the ones that we as citizens control, and they are hellholes. So I always advocate, let's put most of our energy there, and to the issue of privatization, which is not the same thing as private prisons. That is to say, everything in the prison is privatized, from tampons to tasers to telephones. And so that we can put a lot of energy into getting rid of, because as long as you can profit off of mass incarceration, then it will make it 10 times harder to undo. I know several people want to jump in on these other comments. I just want to say that I fully agree that because incarceration has absolutely destroyed communities, as you so rightly point out, one of the impacts of this is to remove so many adult males. And we know this, and we know that any community where this many children are orphaned are going to suffer tremendously. But I also want us to maybe take a bit of a bigger view than just this idea of mentoring in the community. Because the fact of the matter is, these are communities that have been ravaged at so many levels. That is one of the profound ones. But this is also a community that has been deeply impoverished by mass incarceration. So it's not just the removal of fathers, it is the removal of income. It is the removal of housing, it is the removal of schools, it is the removal of opportunity. And so, yes, young teenage boys, for example, because I've had 2 of those, They are, you know, young teenage boys can be rowdy, and yeah, they need strong parents. But it's amazing to me how in communities with resources, even those boys with single parents, without fathers, they still manage to do okay. And here's why: because they've got a community of resources to help out, right? They have good schools, they have good counselors, they have good mental health facilities. The mothers who are raising them are supported in a totally different way because they have means. So I think that, you know, we need to bring men back to the community, absolutely, but we also simultaneously need to demand that these communities are not ravaged at every level. This young man, thank you. This young man mentioned, you know, these boys are being put on Ritalin. Let's call this for what it is. Young kids, by the way, and not just young boys. The fastest growing group of people being incarcerated right now are actually black and brown girls. So right now, that's the fastest growing trend. But what's the common denominator? The common denominator is criminalizing black and brown spaces at every level, from cradle to prison. And so this is about treat every community the same way that upper middle class white people demand that their communities are treated. And that is to say, decent schools, decent counselors, decent all this stuff. Because then, if you get a divorce, it's not going to mean that your child ends up in prison. Or if, God forbid, your partner is killed or something, it's not going to guarantee that your son ends up in prison. This community is ravaged at so many levels that the absence of fathers, I fear that if we brought every father back home, then this horror would still happen on their watch too, because there's no opportunity in these ravaged communities.
Other panelists, anybody else want to jump in? Please do. Yeah.
Well, I wasn't going to, you know, I happened to bring this NAACP report with me. Milwaukee Today, an occasional report of the NAACP. Basically, it says exactly what you just said. At the same time, guess what the single best predictor is of a teen or young adult engaging in I'm trying to recall the exact title of this, but what it is violent behavior in terms of assault using a weapon, the single best predictor. Father absence.
More than violence in the home? More than domestic assault in the home, or more than?
Single best predictor, yes.
I'd like to see which communities that's all being compared with.
Well, I can give you the citation.
Other. Are there other comments to the?
Oh, you're saying third grade reading scores are also another good indicator?
That's how they do it for jails. They look at the third grade reading scores.
Okay.
Thank you. Great. Are there other panelists who have comments to the first several questions and comments from the audience? Or if not, we'll go to some more questions.
I just want to push back a little bit on our author, because we have to do a dual analysis, I think, of our community. Communities can be decimated. We are under-resourced relative to other communities. That's clear. At the same, so we have to hold the system accountable. I always believe it, and that won't ever get off that dime. But in addition, we're here in Milwaukee, a fairly fragmented community, and we have the capacity to collaborate at a higher level, organizationally, interfaith-wise, cross-community-wise. We are, as we know, the most segregated city in the nation. And so as a result, some of our resources go underutilized. There are synergies that could be created between organizations or projects that we don't capture because we are fragmented. So we do have some decimation as a result of lack of resources. This community could do can do better, can be stronger, can unite better. I don't want to be pie in the sky and utopian, but we have a large upside the more we gather together and work together and advocate together. So I just want to nudge a little bit on that.
And totally agree. I mean, community activism and community solidarity is critical, so totally agree.
Yeah, let me read us a short statement out of this report. Children in single-parent homes are twice as likely to drop out of high school, twice as likely to have a child before age 20, 1.5 times more likely to be out of school and out of work in their late teens and early 20s, 2 to 3 times more likely than children in two-parent families to have emotional and behavioral problems, and they are at a dramatically greater risk to suffer from drug and alcohol abuse. Fatherless boys are more likely than others to engage in violence. Father absence is more significant than poverty in predicting criminal involvement, and Black family disruption has the strongest effect on Black juvenile criminality, and it substantially increases the rate of Black murder and robbery. So that's pretty serious, but it's
so my question
convolution with all of those other factors that you mentioned as well.
Yes, and my only question is, I mean, this is the social scientist in me, what is the subject pool? Is this all single children in America, in all families, or is this, in other words, I mean, it's important, right? Because is this a condemnation of single parenting? Is it a condemnation of poverty and single parenting? Is it a condemnation of race, poverty, and single parent? In other words, what's the sample?
You know,
and that's important.
You know what?
I'm going to have to.
I have to say this real quickly.
Yeah, brother moderator, come on.
I have to say this real quickly. One should not have anything but the highest respect and admiration for these people, male or female, who are trying to raise trying to raise children as a single parent. This is not a condemnation by any means of individuals who are single parents. It's a mere just unfortunate fact of life that children in two-parent homes tend to fare better than children in single-parent homes. That's just the reality of it. And I had to sort of laugh because what's happening here is you've got two social scientists kind of butting heads, you know, back and forth on the same panel. But
well, we got the rest of the evening, so let's let
and there's and more than that, one who's from Detroit and one who's from Flint, Michigan.
It goes back that far. Joe, we've got time for really one more question. We've got to wrap this thing up at 4:30, and I want to give our panelists a chance to offer some closing comments. Can you give us one more question, please?
Yeah, I've been instructed quite a lot by the Republican parties telling us what we need to end for a long time and don't have anything to put in place. So I'm wondering, since the situation we're in now is not going to end overnight, right? So what is it that we have to offer those who are unconvinced? You know, what's the better way, all right? So we can all talk about, you know, how you get there before the crime, and that's clearly our big goal. But in the interim between now and then, we need to also have some kind of plan so that we're not just saying no incarceration and that's the end of it. Because if we do that, then the people that are not in agreement with us are going to say, well, you got nothing. I mean, no, don't just turn those people on the streets, right? And those people is how they'll refer to it. So, you know, like what do we have to put in that place, that sort of placeholder in the interim during that time?
And in fact, Joe, I'm going to allow that to be our closing question. So as you all start to think about responses, could you each respond to that question as best as, I have to wrap us up by 4:30. I've got explicit and clear direction that if I don't get us done at 4:30, something bad will happen to me. So I do have to tie us up, and I apologize. Maybe we can have some informal conversations. But I'd like our panelists to respond to that question, and then we'll go ahead and close our panel discussion today.
Central or daylight time?
Let me start off by going back to something that Heather said at the beginning, which is the idea that, and I think this is something that we can have a more immediate impact on, and that is changing our laws, mandatory minimums, truth in sentencing, the kind of penalties that we mete out for misconduct. But the idea that, if you're in the suburbs, you see all kinds of the same kind of behavior that never gets punished the way it does in the inner city. There's an organization called weareallcriminals.org, and we are. How many here have never done anything that would be a crime, whether it's shoplifting or whatever? At some point, either we or our children have all done things that they've not been punished the same way as other communities have. And I think it's tragic, but also very telling that this opioid addiction that has now, the epidemic that is spreading the country and has spread into the suburbs, and now that there's white kids dying, and even one of our state legislators' daughter now arrested and charged with a Lynn Bias homicide type of offense. Suddenly people are waking up and thinking, hey, we need to do something about this. This is a health crisis, not a lock 'em up criminal crisis. And but I also think it's important that the other point that Heather made is that this is a bipartisan problem. It has to have a bipartisan solution. So we can't just blame one party, Republicans or conservatives. We need to find where there's common ground. And it's also telling to me that when a state like Texas has managed to reduce their incarceration significantly over the last 5 years, and we haven't. That's a very conservative state, obviously. We all know that. And yet there's ways to do it they've found. Now, their motivations may not be moral-based, they're financial, they're pocketbook. But if that's a common ground where we can reach across the aisle and get agreement on that, this is a waste of money. Our taxpayer money is just being, pissed away on these prisons. Then we ought to do that. We ought to find where we can assist them, and there are better models out there. It's not a matter of, okay, let's just open the prisons or no longer incarcerate people. You can punish without throwing away someone's life forever. You can punish them. The single biggest reason I think that our prisons are so overcrowded is the advent of mandatory minimums. Judges hate it, prosecutors hate it. Even many victims hate it because they oftentimes want someone to get help. They don't want them to go off for a mandatory 5 years in prison or 10 years in prison, whatever it might be. That and this truth in sentencing that happened in Wisconsin in 1999, where, okay, we're going to make people do their full sentence and not let them out on parole anymore. And they assumed that judges would reduce the length of their sentences accordingly, and they have not. And so for people who used to get a 10-year sentence and maybe would only serve 3, 4, 5 years, they're now serving the full 10. And we've had a whole generation of that kind of sentencing. Those are things that we can do on the back end without taking a lot of money to say, okay, how are we going to improve these communities? Yes, we need to do that too. We need to, as particularly the experience of Milwaukee, this segregated, impoverished community that we have here. But there are things where we can find common ground with conservatives and reach out for bipartisan solutions that I think can help ameliorate the problem while we work on the longer term ones as well.
Thank you. Attorney Lanier, thoughts?
Ditto. It's my executive summary. Dr. King said somewhere in one of his speeches, honor what you put on paper. And I'll just go back to my first points. Prison administrators, DOC administrators, MSDF administrators, and prison guards and COs have some obligations to treat those who are incarcerated a particular way, to act as professionals. They went to school, they've got jobs, in theory they've got performance appraisals, and so honor what's on paper and treat people the way they're supposed to be treated. I think our faith-based organizations need to speak more loudly. The MICAs of the world and the Pastors Uniteds of the world. I'm on MICA's Religious Leaders Committee about the humanity of those who are incarcerated. I'm a Christian preacher, and so for me, Matthew 25 says what we've done unto the least of these, we've done to others, and it includes those who are naked. Do we clothe them? Those who are hungry, do we feed them? And those who are incarcerated, do we visit them? Do we pay attention to them? Does not make a distinction between guilt or innocence. It just recognizes that this is somebody who is further outside the community, but we still have an obligation to serve them, and so we need to speak that. And then last but not least, again, we've got a Constitution that says some things about rights, that says some things about process, and are we honoring those rights for those citizens while they're incarcerated? So those are my thoughts and pressure points and messaging points that I would put forward.
Thank you. Professor McNeely.
You know, one of the themes that's been very pervasive throughout this whole conversation has been the issue of transparency. You know, what you have in the Department of Corrections is a closed system. Things take place because the basic attitude of people in the department, or many people, is in reference to inmates. Your rearing is mine until you get out of here. I'm gonna do what I want to do with you. And that's just the way it is. And that can happen because it's a dark system you can't see. So we need to bring light to what's going on behind those closed doors. We need some transparency. And again, I go to what I had suggested for consideration a little bit earlier, and that is these independent monitoring and oversight boards, but they have to be statutorily authorized so that they can't just be terminated at the whim of the Department of Correction. And it has, these boards have to include people who are not likely to be bamboozled, that is, people who have expertise in areas that are relevant to the administration of justice, let's call it that. And that's a whole nother issue because I want to talk about discretion too, from the police all the way through. But these boards can bring light because they're actually authorized to be in the prisons, in the correctional systems, and have the authority to reveal what's going on. Now, I'm sure everybody agrees that if somebody is watching you, you're less likely to screw up. That's what happens with these. And one of the positive things of being observed, frankly, is that it helps to professionalize the correctional officers so that they don't screw up because they're more mindful of what it is that they should be doing with reference to the treatment of those who are incarcerated. And you must recognize that if there's any population that is weak and in need of some assistance, it's going to be an incarcerated population. They don't have rights like one would normally expect people to have. So bringing transparency, bringing light to what's going on within these halls and corridors and cells of these correctional systems is something that we have to figure out how to get implemented. And how that's going to get implemented is going to be with people like you and me. Like I said earlier, maybe some thought of an affiliation with FCAB and the Turners, and FCAB and others, and the Turners and other organizations, so that there's a coalition of some sort helping to press our legislators and helping to publicize these kinds of solutions. There may be other solutions that we haven't mentioned that we will want to promote. But the only way it's going to work, we have to get together. Thank
you, sir. Dr. Thompson, final words.
Yeah, and I think that we got to change the laws, and we need to be transparent. If prisons were translucent cubes in the middle of our downtowns and we could walk by every single day and see what happened in them, that'd be a long way to improving our situation right now. But I kind of took the question a little differently. Maybe it's just because I'm a historian, and that is kind of, how do we get people to imagine something different than what we have? How do we get people to imagine a different way of dealing with wrongdoing, or a different way of dealing with breaking of the law? You know, can we imagine a world without prisons is kind of the subtext of your question. And I won't get into that, but I will just suggest that it is humbling when you realize, and this is the historian in me, we have never done it this way ever in American history, the way we're doing it right now. And no country on the planet is doing it the way we're doing it. So this is new. This system is new. It is only 40 years old. We have only been doing this for 40 years, and in the scheme of human history, that's a drop in the bucket. So before now, we imagined lots of other ways to deal with people that were mentally ill, drug addicted, committed crimes, and we could go on. We had other solutions, so we need to remember that and have some faith. We need to have faith that most human beings, when they know what's going on, do the right thing, actually. When they see wrong committed, they actually step up, so we need to let them see what's going on. But also, we got models around the globe of other people that do this differently with enormous success, and that's including dealing with things like domestic violence and murder. So I say we just need to get a lot smarter about this, and let's start with transparency, because that's something that everyone can usually agree on, except for the people that are hiding behind those walls.
Thank you all very, very much. We want to encourage you to sign in. If you haven't provided contact information, please sign in with one of our sign-in sheets so that you can stay in touch and find out more information. Please join me in thanking all of our panelists one more time. We do have to conclude. Obviously, if there's a chance to do some informal connecting as we begin to wrap up, please do so. Thank you all very much tonight for coming out and having this conversation with us.
An MCM production.